Hi there, and welcome to the Online Book Review. I am your host, Stacey Cochran, and we are online with thriller author Raymond Benson. Raymond is the author of, or was the fourth author of the James Bond series of thriller novels, as well as a number of very successful standalone novels, and we have a lot of ground to cover today. I'd like to thank you, Raymond, for being on our Skype interview here on the Online Book Review.
Hi, thank you for having me, Stacey.
Well, we have a lot of ground to cover. The first thing that I want to talk about, though, is kind of the convergence of technology, publishing, and marketing of books. You know, in reading over your biography of your distinguished career, the first impression that I had is that you seem to, throughout your career, have embraced technology and innovation. Can you discuss how you respond to new technologies related to publishing and the marketing of books and stories?
Well, let me back up to the 80s. I got into computer gaming designing in the 80s, and that was a whole new technology and new thing. You know, the PCs were just coming into the home. I was the proud owner of an Apple IIc, and I started designing my first computer games on that, and so that was very new. And from that point on, I started really realizing what technology could do for entertainment and for media. I was still working in the computer gaming business in the early 90s, and using DOS a little bit, and not as a programmer, but as a writer. And you know, then suddenly we had Windows and all that stuff. And you know, I guess nobody really foresaw that, you know, books would be read on a electronic device. It was something you saw in science fiction movies. Very early on in this millennium, I was working with a company called Publishing Online, based in Washington, and they were doing ebooks. And at the time, they were brand new. That was just something that nobody else was really doing. And they asked me if I would be interested in doing a serial novel on their website. And this novel turned out to be my book, Evil Hours. And what they would do is they would put a chapter online on their website to try to get people coming back. But they also published the entire book as an ebook. And that was my first experiences with ebooks. This was in the year 2000 and 2001, and they didn't do so well. I think people just weren't ready for ebooks at that time.
Right.
And shortly after that, in the year 2003, I did another deal with a British publisher that was doing ebooks called 21st Century Publishing, 21st Century Publishers Limited. And they did my book Faceblind, and they also did Evil Hours. I'm not sure how much they've sold as an ebook, but they also did print-on-demand books, which was another kind of new process that was happening. It was something I wanted to try and to see if it would work. Unfortunately, I think in the publishing world, in the so-called real publishing world, New York publishers, agents, that kind of thing, they kind of look down at the whole publishing on-demand thing.
Sure.
If you've done that, you've kind of dug a hole for yourself.
Unless you do very well.
Yeah. So I think the jury is still out. I think publishers in New York are still trying to decide what they want to do with regard, because you know the publishing industry right now is not in good shape. You know, we're going to see a lot of changes in the next 10 years, especially. I think with the Kindle coming out and the Sony Reader and things like that, it's starting to make the curve for change.
I think so as well, and I definitely want to get to talking about some of that. But let's kind of focus a little bit on your own process. Of course, our audience for these interviews is a lot of aspiring writers, a lot of folks over on the Kindle boards and Kindle authors. So let's talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you've used over the years to find a comfortable balance between writing your books and then marketing and promoting your books?
Well, it's two different disciplines. It really is. It's two different things that you, I mean, these days the easy part is writing the book. You know? Once you've got a book written, then the hard stuff really begins. First, you've got to sell it to a publisher, which is no easy task these days. And secondly, you've got to sell it to the public. And that's no easy task these days because, especially in this country, in America, you've got a lot of competition. And trying to get noticed among all the you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other authors and books that are out there, it takes some doing.
So what kinds of strategies have you used to
Well, I'm trying to use, you know, the internet as best I can, you know, using Facebook and MySpace and my own website. I think those things are essential now. Certainly trying to do public events is all well and good if you can afford to move around the country, but you know, most people can't do that. I try to do things locally. I live in the Chicago area, so I always set up some appearances. Going to writers' conferences like Thriller Fest and VoucherCon,
Sure.
Love is Murder in Chicago, things like that, that helps a lot. Doing interviews like this helps a lot. Whatever you can do. I have a good friend of mine who is probably on the Kindle boards too. His name is J.A. Conrath, and he is like the master of marketing. He's the guy that will get in his car and drive to 500 stores around the country just to walk in and introduce himself. And that's so that the bookstore employees, when they come to that 6-month mark where they have to send books back to the publisher, they'll see his name and go, "Oh, he was a nice guy. Maybe we'll leave him on the shelf." You know. Sure. So
I know Joe. I know Joe very well. Yeah.
Yeah. He's and his blogging, and I mean, I don't know how he has time to write. He spends so much time marketing himself.
It does seem a little bit on the extreme side, but you know, I think he's found a comfortable balance for himself, and that's what this is all about. Everybody kind of has to find their comfort zone, you know. Right. Now you were the fourth.
You know, then there's the Lee Childs and the Michael Connollys and people like that who really don't have to do anything. they're marketed for them, you know. So, you know, they're great guys too, and they write great books. But you know, there's different tiers of us authors, and we each have to do what we can to make that to play in the pond, so to speak.
Sure, it's you know, it's a pretty big sandbox. We each find our little corner to play in, no doubt about it. Now, you were the 4th official writer of the James Bond 007 novels. Tell us the story of your involvement with that project from your very earliest memories of James Bond and interest in James Bond in general to actually how you wrote the nonfiction book and then how the project of writing the novels came to you.
Okay. Well, I'm a child of the 50s and 60s. I was in on the Connery films from the beginning. Mm-hmm. My father, I was 9 years old, my father took me to see Goldfinger. And that same year, Dr. No and From Russia with Love came out as a double bill. So I saw the first 3 films in the theater in 1 year. And at that time, you know, nothing like that had ever been really seen before. They were the Star Wars of that decade. And,
sure.
Yeah, you know, I was hooked and went out, and even though I was probably too young at the time, I went out and got Ian Fleming's books and started reading them, and did very, you know, got through them and understood them and reread them again a few years later, and just became basically, you know, a Bond fan. Grew up with him, and but you know, I became a normal person. I went to college and studied theater, went to New York, and was working in theater. But in the early '80s, I got the idea to write a nonfiction book about James Bond, sort of an encyclopedia coffee table book, which actually had not been done at the time. Now there's millions of them. There's tons of these kind of books, but at the time there was only like 1 book on the films, and I think the 1 book on that discussed the novels was out of print, and I wanted a book that had everything, you know, a biography of Ian Fleming and analyses of all the novels and all the films, all in 1 big tome. So I started working on it, and I did get a contract with the publisher. It took me 3 years. I went to England. I met members of Ian Fleming's family and his business people and his colleagues, and we got along well. The book came out in 1984, was well received, was nominated for an Edgar. That sort of established me in the fan community as kind of like a Bond authority, an expert, so to speak. And I stayed in touch with the Fleming people. Did little odd jobs for them over the years. Then in the mid-90s, while I was a computer game designer, John Gardner, who was the author before me, he decided that he didn't want to do it anymore. He announced his retirement, and the Fleming company, which is called Ian Fleming Publications, they came to me and asked me if I'd be willing to give it a shot. So I had to write an outline of the novel first on spec. Once that was approved, I had to write the first 4 chapters on spec, and then I got the contract, and so that's how it all started. So I left the computer gaming world behind and started writing novels and haven't looked back. And so I did the Bond gig for 7 years.
What was the initial catalyst that sustained you, or what would you say, not necessarily catalyst, but what was it that sustained you during that 3-year period when you were trying to find the nonfiction publisher, or the book, or the publisher for your nonfiction book? You know, you'd had a pretty successful career in theater at that point, and you were completely immersed in that, it seemed like. So what was driving you to say, well, I want to try this book publishing thing out?
Well, actually, I always tell a joke. You know, there was no money in theater, so I became a writer.
That was really smart.
You know? Really, there was no money in theater. I mean, I loved doing it, and I was doing it a lot, but and I had a day job, you know, and so I worked the day job while I did the book at night and on weekends. So and then computer gaming became my day job, which was lucky, because that was a very creative environment, and it's a lot like working, you know, on a smaller scale on a movie set. I mean, it's very collaborative effort with where I guess my role was like the screenwriter director, and yeah, that's you know, those were the early years. I was young and full of energy then, so I could juggle a lot of stuff then.
Very cool. It's a fascinating story, and I'm sure it's inspiring to folks watching the video at home. The author is Raymond Benson. He is the author of several standalone novels, maybe best known for writing the James Bond series of novels. Are those, Raymond, is that what you get the most email about and questions about from folks these days?
Yeah, probably. I think, you know, you know, anybody that's been involved with James Bond, it haunts them for the rest of their life. You know, it's just, you know, you're part of the legacy, and you know, I'm proud of it, and I'm pleased to be in it. I like to feel that I've moved on, but you know, they're always pulling me back in. In the words of Al Pacino.
Well, there are worse people to be associated with. I can guarantee you that. Speaking of good folks to be associated with, now you did the Tom Clancy Splinter Cell novels. Can you talk a little bit about how that project came to you?
Well, that came to me through, actually it was the editor of my Bond books at Berkeley. They had the publishing rights for Tom Clancy's books. And, you know, Splinter Cell was a very popular video game. And Clancy's people decided that they would do books based on the game. So my editor came to me and asked if I'd be willing to do it. They wanted to use a pseudonym, an in-house pseudonym, which is David Michaels, who would be the name that they would put on all the books that would be published that were spin-offs of Tom Clancy's video games, no matter who the writer was. So I signed up for 2 of them, the first 2 books, and that's all I did, Splinter Cell and Operation Barracuda. There's a 3rd and 4th book by David Michaels, but it's not me. And there's a book called End War and Ghost Recon. That's another David Michaels. So I don't know how many David Michaels there are now at this point, but it's like, you know, we're clones. It's like a science fiction story. You know, we keep doubling. So.
Well, it had to be gratifying to see the success of those books. They both hit the New York Times bestseller list, right?
Oh yeah, they did. But I don't think it had anything to do with me. I think it's Tom Clancy's name that they put in very big, giant letters on the cover, even though Tom had really nothing to do with it. He's a good guy, but all of those books have hit the bestseller list. I think it doesn't really matter who writes them. It's the Tom Clancy. He's got a cottage industry with his name, so good for him.
Well, what was the experience like working on those books? Was it a positive experience in the end? Did you have fun writing them? Was there a lot of developmental editing as you were going along? It sounds like Tom was not very involved in the project.
No, he really was. I mostly worked with his agent and manager and the game company called Ubisoft.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones really kind of driving the whole thing. I don't recall anything too serious. They went smoothly. I was pleased with the work. They were original stories. They weren't actually based on the games. The first book, actually, they told me, do whatever you want. And I said, well, do I have to, use the characters from the game other than, I knew I had to use Sam Fisher, but do I have to use, like, all his team and all that? And they said, no, you can make people up. So that's what I did, and I think some of the fans didn't like that. And so with the second book, we decided, maybe we better stick with the game, more. And so I brought back in, Grimm's daughter and all those other people. But it kind of came, it was a nice gig for a couple years.
Sure, probably paid pretty well too. So how do you deal with fans that again, our audience for these interviews are a lot of aspiring writers, folks who have published on Kindle, and Kindle reviewers are notorious for giving their feelings about a book, positive or negative. How do you, as a human being and as a writer, how do you process the negative reviews, and then how do the positive reviews, of course, feel to receive?
Well, it's always nice to see positive stuff, and when the negative stuff comes around, you have to take it with a grain of salt. I mean, if you're in this business, you've got to, take the rough with the smooth, so to speak. I mean, there's certain kinds of criticisms that I think are stupid. When it's obvious that the person doesn't really know what they're talking about. That's and then they blast it all over the internet or something. That's not right. But if it's a well thought out, constructive criticism, everybody's entitled to an opinion.
Fair enough. Where did you first learn a love for creativity and the arts? It seems like it's been absolutely who you are your entire life. Where did you first learn a love for creativity and the arts?
It's all I've known, really, since I was a child. It's all I've ever wanted to do. I was always, acting out plays in my garage by myself for the neighborhood kids, stuff like that. And I'm a musician. I play the piano. I was never into the sports thing, or it's always been more of the creative side.
Now, when you were in high school, you really got involved in drama and theater. Was that different in a small town in Texas? Did you see it as something that was different? Was it difficult to do? Who encouraged you in theater?
Well, I had my high school was actually the same high school that is depicted in the movie Friday Night Lights and the book. That's my high school and hometown.
Awesome.
So it was a big, wealthy high school. They had a lot of money for all their departments, not just the football team, which was, of course, the main thing there. But the drama department was actually quite big and well funded, and we had a really good teacher. Her name was Bodine Johnson, and she inspired me a lot. Actually, she taught me a lot, and it was a good department. And then I went on to study theater at the University of Texas.
Now, for somebody who is totally new to Raymond Benson, somebody watching the video, where should they begin with your novels? What would be the best Raymond Benson novel to start with?
Well, that's like choosing between children. But, you know, gee, I really don't know. I mean, there's going to be some people that I would say will certainly start with the Bond books. You know, one of they've been out of print for a while, but they've just some of them have just been reprinted in an anthology called the Union Trilogy. There's 3 novels and a short story. And then next spring there'll be a second anthology called Choice of Weapons. And that will collect all the original novels and the short stories in 2 big volumes, which is kind of nice. But you know, my own original novels are what's personal to me, and I think there's more of me in them, like Evil Hours or Sweetie's Diamonds, or the 2 recent rock and roll thriller books, which feature a detective by the name of Spike Barringer who works in the rock and roll world. The first book is called A Hard Day's Death, and the second one's called Dark Side of the Morgue. There's a lot of humor and music references and cameos by real rock stars. You know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's a lot of fun.
Sounds like great stuff. Now, your video game, The Indian in the Cupboard, won a number of awards and was a total success. What was the process like designing the game, and then how did it feel to have it so well received?
Well, I was working for Viacom New Media at the time, and they also owned Paramount, which was doing the movie at the time, The Indian in the Cupboard. So it was a tie-in to the movie, as well as a tie-in to the book that the movie was based on. So we contacted the Iroquois Nation, and the lead artist on the game and myself went to went to New York State and researched the Native Americans there, and got some help from them, and spent a lot of time doing that. And that's how I came up with a lot of the children's games that were in it. They were based on activities that Iroquois would do.
So how did it feel when you were finally recognized for the...
Oh, it's always a great feeling when you get, awards are fine. They're good.
Send them your way.
Yeah, the one I did right before that, Are You Afraid of the Dark? The Tale of Orpheo's Curse, that also received some accolades. So, but whatever that's worth.
Well, I think your career is entirely inspiring. If only to one person, me, it's totally inspiring, because you're a perfect example of somebody who has a kind of creative genius that is able to translate the ideas of story throughout different media, and that's something that really speaks to me personally. Can you talk about the process of story in different media, like stage, video games, books, music? How is story integral to each?
Well, story is everything. I always, people ask me, do I regret being out of theater? And I say, well, no, because everything I learned, even for novel writing, I learned in theater. I learned from especially my directing professor, Francis Hodge, how to tell a story. And it really doesn't matter what medium you're using. The storytelling is basically the same in all ways. You've got to have your characters, you've got to have your conflicts, you've got to have your 3-act structure, you've got to have a climax, you've got to have a denouement. It doesn't matter. My computer games were story-based. They were adventure role-playing games where you play a character that is wandering through an environment, and you're telling a story as you solve the puzzles of the game. In many ways, thrillers are like that. And it's all relative. I use the same skills writing a novel that I did in directing a play. So I don't know how to explain it. A lot of it's instinct.
Does it begin with the idea of a character? Do you begin with a plot in mind?
Well, both. It depends on the book, really. For example, Sweetie's Diamonds, my novel Sweetie's Diamonds. This is about a single mom high school teacher out in the Chicago suburbs who has a dark past, and this past catches up with her, and she has to go on the run with her son, with her 13-year-old son. And the genesis for that story was I had been involved with Playboy magazine. They had published some of my Bond stories, and so I'd gotten to know Hugh Hefner, and I gotten to know some of the playmates, the Playboy playmates. And I would, I've met some of the ones from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and they're all grown up and married, and they have kids. Some of them have grandkids. And I thought, what does like their kids or their grandkids think about mom or grandma?
Sure.
Being in Playboy. What do they think of that? And that was kind of my idea, because the story, Sweetie's Diamonds, is told from the son's point of view. And the son discovers that his mom was working in the adult film industry in the late 70s. So that's kind of how that happened, how that started. It was just that genesis of an idea. What would happen? How would a kid feel about that?
That's a great example and a great story. I'm sure you're asked a lot, and a lot of writers are often asked where their ideas come from, and that's a perfect example of how it's kind of a synthesis of experiences from real life, and then asking, the classic "what if" kinds of questions. It's a great story. Now, how did growing up in Odessa, Texas, influence you? How did it shape who you are?
Well, I call it Odessalation. I always knew that I would leave. From a very young age, I would go to the public library and I would look at like the New York Times and just look at the entertainment section, like all the movies and all the theater and the plays and everything. I'm going, wow, wouldn't it be cool to live here? Because in Odessa we had 2 movie theaters. And it was, I was aware at the time that I was living in a small town. I mean, it's not really small. I mean, it's small by big city standards, but there was about maybe 75,000 people while I was growing up. Now it's well over 100,000. But it's way out in the desert. It's not a lot of culture there. So as soon as I graduated high school, I went to Austin, Texas, and that's where I really kind of found myself. That's where everything kind of started clicking. That's when I started seeing more like foreign films and exploring literature more, and music, discovering music that I didn't just hear on the radio, that kind of thing. So I would say everything really blossomed once I turned 18, 19, 20, 21.
Now, how was the theater scene similar or different between Texas and then the immersion in the 1980s New York theater scene? Was it similar or different?
Oh, well, it's just the cities were different. New York is a world unto itself. It's just an amazing place, and I was there for so long. I feel like it's home too. So in many ways, I feel like Texas is my home and New York is my home. The theater scene in New York was very vibrant at the time. There was a lot of what we call showcases off Broadway, where you would basically put on a play for free. I mean, you would do it for the love of it, in the hopes that reviewers would come see it, maybe write about it in one of the papers, and then maybe a producer would come see it, and then take it to the next step, which would be either Broadway or off Broadway. So it was, you had to have a lot of energy and a lot of commitment to do it, because you weren't making really money at it. Every now and then you'd get a paying gig, but it wasn't very much. It was not enough to live on.
Do you think it would have been more enjoyable had you been making a lot of money at it? I mean, isn't there something about doing it kind of for the love of it and the passion of it, and having a group of folks who are just committed to developing a play that's kind of...
Well, sure, and I still love it. I mean, I would still like to do that, but at my age and with my family and everything, you've got to juggle.
Sure.
What kind of time commitment are you going to be giving, and what are you going to get back in return? You know, these days I do have to ask. There comes a point in your life when you have to ask, okay, what am I getting in return for what I'm giving out? And so I turned to other things.
And it sounds like having a family was a big part of that sort
yeah,
of turning point.
It was, yeah.
Very cool. Now we talked a little bit about your background in video game, and we've got just a couple more questions here, and we'll sort of wrap things up. Can you discuss a little bit about how you came to actually work in the video game design industry in the 80s?
After the James Bond Bedside Companion was published, I was working with an agent in New York, and a company had come to him that was developing computer games. These were early text adventure games, and they were looking for a writer, and they had the rights to a Stephen King novella, which was The Mist, which was a movie a couple of years ago, and they had the rights to James Bond properties. So my agent, of course, thought of me. So they brought me in, and I was actually into games. I was always into Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s and all that, and I was interested in especially like the Infocom games like Zork. So I was like right up their alley. So I was hired to do it, and I did the Stephen King game and 2 Bond titles, A View to a Kill and Goldfinger. Those were my first 3. So then there was a couple of years lapse, and then I moved my family back to Texas, to Austin. And this was in the early 90s. And then I applied for a job at Origin Systems, which was down in Austin. And they were the makers of the Ultima series and the Wing Commander series. And I got a job, and things just progressed from there.
Very cool. Now, you mentioned one thing there, that your agent was really central to that first game design gig. Can you talk, again, our audience for these interviews is a lot of aspiring writers, a lot of folks right on the cusp of breaking through. How did you find your agent, and what's the secret to a successful business relationship with a literary agent?
Those are questions I can't answer because it's different for everybody. I've had several agents over my career. Some of them were good and some of them are bad. I think, writers often, they spend so much time, and it's such a struggle to find an agent who will represent them, that they'll try to stick with that agent no matter what. And they refuse to see that perhaps the relationship between the two of you isn't that good. Maybe it really is like a marriage. You've got to be with the right person. You've got to have somebody who understands the way you think and the way you feel about things, and so maybe your first agent isn't always the right one. It's a lot different now than it was in the 80s. It's harder. The competition just seems to be much more fierce. The only thing I could say is go to something like Thriller Fest, where they have this thing called Agent Fest as part of it, where they have 50 agents in a room, and you can go and do pitches to all of, as many as you want that day, and you get a little feel right there in person, face to face, which is much better than doing the query letter thing and waiting 2 months for a response, and it's usually a rejection. So there are different ways to approach it, and I think it all depends on one's individual style. The agents they want to make money, so they want to see something from writers that they think will be commercial. It's tough. You've got to balance your art with what you think people will like.
I think that's a hell of a good answer. You know, there's a lot to be said for actually meeting these folks face to face, and then you know, like you said, you don't want to be so desperate that you would sign with somebody who would be ultimately dysfunctional for you. You want a good business partner, and somebody who kind of gets who you are as a writer, and you know, is a fan of what you do ultimately, and that's a big part of it. And I think meeting those folks face to face goes a long way towards building that kind of relationship, no doubt about it. Well, we're just about out of time here, Raymond. What does the future hold for Raymond Benson?
Well, this fall, the sequel to Metal Gear Solid, that was another video game that I did novelizations for. Metal Gear Solid came out last year. The sequel, Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, comes out in November. The second James Bond anthology, Choice of Weapons, comes out in the spring. In the summer of 2010, my entry into the Gabriel Hunt adventure series comes out. This is a series that Dorchester and Hardcase Crime put out, featuring a pulp adventure hero called Gabriel Hunt. There's 6 books in the series. A different author has done each book, and I'm the 6th and final one. The books are credited to Gabriel Hunt because they're told from his point of view. But I wrote the 6th one. It's called Hunt Through Napoleon's Web. And I've got some other irons in the fire, but, you know, got to keep those under wraps for now.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Raymond. And for all of us at the Online Book Review, I want to thank our viewers for tuning in. You can find out all about Raymond Benson at raymondbenson.com. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks.